experiences, I became a real interested in being a history student. So I realized I didn't know much. And I read a history book of Korea in the early 80s that had been published in 1952 called The Hidden History of the Korean War by I.F. Stone, who had published I.F. Stone's Weekly many years. He kind of terminated that paper, I think, in 1970 or 71, just about the time I was really interested in reading it. So I read a lot of old issues. And I thought, as I was reading I.F. Stone's book, I thought, everything that happened in Korea, that happened in Vietnam. It was the same pattern. So again, I was thinking we don't learn anything. And then jump ahead. I hadn't done anything about Korea except I'd read the book in the early 80s. In 1989, I was at the Pentagon with about 1,000 people surrounding the Pentagon. We were locked arms, and I was locked arms with a Korean who was a chaplain at the University of Maryland. You might know Kyo Cho. And after we were not arrested, they were lifting people over us to get in the Pentagon rather than arrest us. There was a lot of us there. Kuehl said to me, he says, why don't you go with me to Korea? And I had never really thought of going to Korea. And so I said, I'll think about it. But I didn't really think too much about it yet. That was in October of 1989. A few months later, I was actually in London on a speaking tour, and I was sitting in a cafe having a sandwich and a drink, and somebody tapped me on the shoulder, and it was Kyo Cho. I know it sounds bizarre, but he said, Brian, have you decided what you're going to do? And at that point, I said, yes, I'm going.
Go with the flow.
Well, I was so amazing.
It was destiny.
So I actually, the Pentagon action was in 88. And so this was in early 89. And when I was in this cafe, and a trip, and so I was part of a delegation of some North Americans and some Europeans that went to North Korea in July of 1989, just after Tiananmen Square had happened in Beijing. And that was my first experience in Korea, and I've subsequently been to Korea 7 times, including another trip to North Korea. And I've really become fascinated with Korean history and the history of U.S. intervention, the history of Korean culture, and that has really. I'm trying to finish my own book on the history of Korea through my 8 trips and all the reading I've done. And actually, Martin Hart-Landsberg and Cummings, what's his first name? Bruce Cummings, I think are the only 2 gringo academic people that are really knowledgeable about the history of Korea. There may be some Korean professors in this country, I'm not sure. But so I rely on Marty and Bruce Cummings for reading a lot of the history. And then there's a new book out by George
Katsanfakis.
Katsanfakis. Yeah, Katsanfakis. Who published a book called Asians Unknown Uprisings by PM Press, and there's a great chapter here on Jeju, Jeju. And this is the same publisher that published my book. So if you learn about what happened in Jeju 45, 46, 47, and especially 48, 49, and 50, it's a microcosm of the whole Korean War. I have this Life magazine article from September 1945, which is about the Japanese surrender. They surrendered on September 2nd, 1945, and this is on the USS Missouri. This is a picture from the USS Missouri. This is September 2nd, 45. The Koreans, who had been occupied by Japan since 1910, they couldn't speak the language, they couldn't dress as Koreans, hated the Japanese. And so they were celebrating as the Japanese were surrendering. And on September 6th, the Koreans declared their independence. On September 7th, MacArthur notified them they were under occupation. And that's the kind of the part of the context of what the people of Jeju were thinking and feeling in 1948 when our titular head, Syngman Rhee, who we flew to Korea in General MacArthur's plane from the United States in 1945 to be our man, a Methodist or Presbyterian in a country that wasn't particularly Methodist or Presbyterian, kind of like bringing DM, a Catholic, to Vietnam 9 years later in a Buddhist Confucianist country, and a lot of Koreans were Buddhists and Confucianists as well. So knowing that history of how much the Koreans did not want to be occupied by another country, no matter who it was, and then Syngman Rhee, who was a brutal dictator, was already on a campaign of repression against labor, against all the people that were organized in opposition to the United States occupation, or Syngman Rhee as our head, basically. He announced in 1948 that he was going to have elections. And by the way, Korea, like Vietnam, was artificially divided. It was not two countries. In fact, it doesn't even really have minorities, like Vietnam has lots of minorities. Korea is pretty homogeneous culture. And so, the division that had been created by President Truman in 1945 was still in force. And so Syngman Rhee said, we're going to unify with North Korea, which was north of the 38th parallel, against the wishes of the majority of the Korean people. And so what is called the Jeju Uprising, which occurred in April of 1948, and actually continued for a couple of years, these people were saying, we do not want to have a separate election to legitimize this division. We still want an election in the whole country. And, of course, Syngman Rhee was our man. And so the governor of Jeju Island at the time told, I think it was the U.S. ambassador, or at least some U.S. official, that as many as 60,000 Jeju Islanders were murdered. The common figure is 30,000, but he admitted 60,000, and 40,000 had fled in boats. A third of the entire population of Jeju Island, which was about 300,000 at the time. So a third of the people were either killed or left because of the repression by Syngman Rhee's forces, the Korean Constabulary, which we created as Rhee's army. Before the Republic of Korea army was established after the election of 48, which Koreans didn't acknowledge. I mean, they didn't honor most of the Koreans. And so the Jeju Islanders now are being besieged by this deep water port that's being constructed on. The island is 70 miles south of the mainland of Korea. It's a pretty large island, and I think now it has about 600,000 population. So they're building, the Koreans are building this deep water port to host Asia's destroyers, AEGIS, missile-equipped destroyers, Korean destroyers and U.S. destroyers, ostensibly, or not ostensibly, but really apparently as a part of Obama's plan to encircle China and to militarize this whole Asian Pacific region. Look at all the places we now have bases in Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, of course Okinawa, even though we're leaving, some of our troops are leaving there, and Guam, and Korea, and we've had as many as 100 bases in Korea. And I don't know how many are bases. There's supposedly some of them have been closed. We probably know more. But there's been over 100 bases in Korea for many U.S. bases. So the Jeju Islanders now are really so angry that this pristine island, which has been designated by UNESCO for several several awards or designations for being heritage sites and biodiverse sites. These people don't want to be militarized, and of course, and it's located on Gangjong Island, which Gangjong Village on the southeastern side of the island. And this has been going on really for a couple of years, but really intensively for the last year. And many are being arrested. I noticed today that one of the priests, I think that's been arrested, they're trying to put him in prison for 2 years. That was what I saw today. The prosecutor is saying they want him locked up for 2 years. So that's kind of why Veterans for Peace is interested in antidoting this militarization, but also to support the Korean people in solidarity against more intervention in their lives, more harassment in their lives. And if anybody's interested, I have photos from 1948, 49, and 50 from the U.S. archives that were taken by U.S. intelligence officers of both Jeju Island and the firing squads. You've probably seen these pictures. They're very intense. And here's some of the prisoners on Jeju Island, actually, in 48. And actually, these are pictures from 48. So these are available in the U.S. archives at the University of Maryland, I guess. But it shows the level of complicity of the U.S. in the slaughter, and all these photos are taken by U.S. officers. So they're not even taken by Koreans, they're taken by U.S. officers, including pictures of Korean constabulary being ordered by U.S. officers, so you'll be in the picture, and another officer's taking the picture of Koreans digging their own grave, and then getting in the grave, and then being shot in the grave. These are all pictures in our archives. And they will be in my book when I get my book out, because they're all in they're in the public domain. So, Marty.
Let me just ask a question here too. I mean, one of the things that the Veterans for Peace, it was the peace teams, Tark and Elliot and others have come together around the Occupy movement. And after seeing Scott Olson, who was in Oakland, who was hit by tear gas canister
into the brain.
Yeah, and all of a sudden, we said, people came out and started marching. Veterans came out from everywhere to support the Occupy movement. And so out of VFP, they decided that since they're right there in the Occupy movements, Tarek decided they wanted to put together these training things for nonviolent participation, where they would be actually in between the police and the demonstrators to represent themselves as veterans for peace, showing that they were nonviolent and that the people behind them were nonviolent. And then they were asked to go to Jeju Island. And so one thing we have to, we got to keep asking that question, why? Why was somebody who has their whole position is to be nonviolent is such a threat for them to be there? And this is a continuing question. I do think, even if they say you can't fly, that we should be saying something to the ambassadors. We should be arguing the point that you had a right to go, you were asked to go, that they should be giving us a reason. Whether they will or not, that's one thing. But I think we need to ask that question, and that's one of the things we can continually challenge and put it. I think that another thing is that they wanted to really they wanted to silence this information because you don't hear it. That's why I wanted to do this event, so that people could hear about what's going on. And it's pretty much a media blackout on this information. And that's why they wanted to stop the veterans from going, so that they didn't have anything to report. And but I think it backlashed on them.
Incidentally, there's a large Veterans for Peace chapter in Korea. They're Koreans.
Right. That's right.
In fact, there's hundreds of them.
That's right.
And there was a delegation that was in Jeju waiting to greet the Veterans for Peace members. And they were waiting and waiting, and then they realized what had happened. And they went back to Seoul and had a press conference in front of the military headquarters in Seoul, decrying this censorship and deportation of people who were coming to Korea to see Jeju Island. And incidentally, this is the hat for this was at least the first version of the Veterans Peace Team, which is a project of Veterans for Peace. This is what the hat looks like. My name's Shane Swin. I was given an honorary membership right away, and they sent me this hat. So the Veterans Peace Teams are being trained in nonviolence to go to these different places, and this just happened. The Jeju thing just happened to be emerging as we were getting these schemes started. So that was like almost the first dispatch. But specifically designed to be, they're going to be at the NATO, they're going to be in Chicago.
The Korean Veterans for Peace are going to be in Chicago?
No.
No.
The Veterans Peace Teams, the Veterans for Peace in the United States are going to be there to
get beat up.
Be on the front line.
that's what they're trained to accept.
Well, I just want to say first that I'm really honored to be with Mike and Brian here and to be, part of a fundraiser for the local chapter here, because I think the work that you do, the experiences you've had that you share, that poem you read was pretty incredible, and the work you both do, all of you do, is absolutely critical, and so I'm really honored to be here with you both. So just to play a little bit off of what Brian said, and then sort of go a little bit beyond in sort of more contemporary sense. So Jeju Island is an absolutely gorgeous island, and I had the good fortune to have visited there in 1990. And as Brian mentioned, that island, the people on there have experienced tremendous suffering. At least a third, maybe had a population of 300,000 at the time that Brian was mentioning before the Korean War started. People often think the Korean War started problems, but the problems started because the U.S. divided the country and people resisted. So hundreds of thousands of people were killed in the South fighting the division even before the Korean War started. But the torment that the people in Jeju experienced, and then because it was a military government in Korea up until roughly
A U.S. military government.
Well, yeah, but I mean even after that, the South Korean military dictatorship. You're right. I suppose so. But the military dictatorship, all the way up through the 80s, those people could not speak of their relatives who were killed because to be associated with them, they were branded communists and traitors, and South Korean national security law, you would be in big trouble. So these people suffered in a culture where honoring your relatives and things is so critical, not being able to talk about the experiences they had. Until recently, in the 2000s, when civilian presidents came to office, there was sort of an opening up. And so, as Brian mentioned, Jeju was declared by UNESCO a biosphere reserve, incredible natural beauty, coral reefs, and Korean people for a long time would go there for honeymoons, for holidays, to swim, to experience this incredible beauty. And the previous president in South Korea actually declared it an absolute preservation zone, so there would be no construction to preserve the beauty. And in 2006, he declared it the island of peace and officially apologized to the people of Jeju for that history. And then in 2007, the president was elected, a right-winger, really vicious right-winger. And I want to come back around to this, but the point is that from his point of view, the whole movement of democracy, South-North attempts at reconciliation were a threat. And so his interest is very much reaffirming the tensions, rebuilding relationships with the U.S. military, reversing some of the democratization. So he moved. The U.S. wants that base, but the South Korean government, the right-wingers, and their military are eager partners because it strengthens their relationship. And while the tensions between the North Korea and the U.S. become justification for our keeping military in Japan, for sending military, having troops in the mainland. The right wing in South Korea loves it as well. In the same way that national security in the United States is an excuse for suppression of rights, the tensions with the North are an excuse for the South Korean government to suppress political movements and labor movements. Okay? And so this guy agreed to this base, to build this base, and he went in and violating the laws which said you can't build, trampled the laws, sent in military people, pushed people off the land, and see these villagers fought to keep their land because it wasn't just a matter of their homes. This base was going to destroy all the coral reefs, spoil all the spring water that was the water for the island, and that's the only water sources, and beautiful stuff. And so one of the reasons why it's been rushed is because the islanders have fought so hard that the publicity was increasing, that the decision was made to get in there and destroy all the environment so that they couldn't go back. And so it's this battle that's being waged as people try and stop the bulldozers, which have now begun, and bring in people, what they don't want, as you so well put it. They don't want the news coming back. And so this is really, in many ways, a joint U.S.-South Korean effort that has little to do with defending the country, because it's far from the North, and it has everything to do with a naval base so the U.S. can project power relative to China, and destroy, the way of life, the environment, the way of life in Jeju, but launch the country once again back into this maelstrom of militarism, and I guess, the consequences are going to be severe because the Chinese understand this. They're going to rearm. It gives Japanese militarists a chance to say, oh, well, the Chinese said they're going to rearm. And what it does is it spreads a militarism throughout the region, which, of course, comes back to us because here we are fighting for social programs and things where the military continues to accelerate its spending, and what is the justification? So it's something that's happening there that we have responsibilities for as Americans, but it's not just an Asian issue. The kind of militarism that this is designed to promote, that flows from a militarist policy and the class interests that drive it in the South and in Japan and in the United States, comes back and affects people throughout the region. So that's why I think it's so critically important, the solidarity there, but also that we connect our solidarity with these people with this wider history. So we see it as more than just this one event, this one little island. What we're really fighting is, this is another example, another attempt to try and stop this militarism, to connect back to that history, to see what's happening, why people are doing this, right? And to try and reclaim that history that's been lost, invisible in the United States, about U.S. roles, the South Korean history, as not just to bring the history up, but so that we can, try and stop this militarism and do something good for the people of Korea and for us and for the Asia-Pacific region. So there's a lot at stake, not just in stopping, if we can, this, but even if we can't, helping people understand what this is all about, so that people in the United States, people in Korea can take a firmer stand to stop this, not beyond this one event. So costs are very high. There's a lot at stake. And I guess one of the things I wanted to do, and I'll try and do some of this quickly because I'm sure you may have questions and want to talk and things, and Brian already began to lay out some of the early history. But, the U.S. presents itself as we're there to help Korea. The U.S. has never really cared about Korea. I mean, starting in the mid-19th century, 1850s, the U.S. started pushing westward. They followed Britain into China, taken part of China, and then they went and forced open Japan, and then they took Hawaii. We took Hawaii, the U.S. government, and then we took the Philippines to project power. And this is where Korea starts to come in, because Japan was witnessing, the Western colonization, and thought, well, how do I resist that? Well, that's okay. We'll become a colonizer too. And so they went to Korea. So, well, we can take Korea. Nobody else really seems that interested. And the U.S. response was, you can have Korea as long as you leave the Philippines alone. So we'll let you have this. And the U.S. helped Japan defeat Russia in 1905 in a war over who would control Korea. We funded them, and we got them a peace treaty, and we basically said, take Korea. And so in 1905 they took Korea, 1910 they annexed it, and Korea ceased to exist as an independent
And
country.
just interject here,
Mhm.
President Theodore Roosevelt won the Nobel Peace Prize for that, arranging that peace in 1905.
And the Korean people had many debates about how to fight the Japanese, and one branch of them said we have to appeal to the West. And so they appealed in 1918 to Woodrow Wilson and the peace treaty. Will you recognize us? Wilson, no. We're only releasing the colonies of the countries who lost the war. Japan was our ally. And the 20s, the Koreans tried again. No, we don't really want to hear. We want to keep relations. And it really wasn't until the U.S. and Japan squared off in the War of the Pacific, the Second World War, that the U.S. suddenly no longer was that interested in dealing with Japan, and now viewed Korea as something that was important to us as a strategic player between China, Japan, and the Soviet Union. And the U.S. made very clear what its plan was. They talked to the Soviet Union in Yalta in 1945 and said, well, after the war's over, we'll make a trusteeship to Korea. They're not going to be independent. And Stalin was quoted as saying, well, I don't really think we need it, but if so, the shorter the better. And what happened then is that the U.S. needed the Soviet Union to fight the Japanese, who had troops in northern China, in Manchuria, in Korea, and the U.S. was going to go attack the Japanese mainland. So the Soviets said, as soon as 1 month after the war in Europe's over, we're going to move against the Japanese. And the United States, by that time, had the atomic bomb. And they didn't want the Soviets to enter that war because they already felt that having worked with the Soviets in Germany, that the Soviets weren't going to roll over to what the U.S. wanted. And they didn't want the Soviet Union to actually have a role in determining post-war Japan. So they dropped the atom bomb, hoping to force the Japanese to surrender very quickly before the Japanese. We didn't need to drop the bomb. If the Soviets had come into the war and they kept asking the U.S., should we do it, the U.S. said, no, don't do it. Because the U.S. didn't want to have to negotiate with the Soviets. So to keep that, we atom bombed Japan. We had secret cables which said the Japanese were waiting to hear what the Soviets would do. And since the U.S. refused to bring the Soviets in, the Japanese kept thinking, well, there's maybe some hope. To make a long story short, when they dropped the bomb, it was the same time that the Soviets, following what they said, began to move into the Korean Peninsula. The Japanese didn't surrender right away, and so the U.S. became very frightened. What's going to happen if the Soviets occupy all the peninsula? So they agreed to let the emperor stay, and then announced, this is the order about the military government, we will take, we said, the surrender of Japan south of the 38th parallel. Soviet troops were almost down. We were weeks away from ever getting there. And the Soviets said, okay, and they stopped at the 38th parallel and began taking the surrender of Japanese troops. The U.S. wasn't ready to go there, so what did they say? Well, Japanese, you're there. Why don't you maintain order for us? These are the same people who had colonized Korea, denied them their language, took all the young Korean women, hundreds of thousands, and turned them into prostitutes. And the U.S. just said, yeah, stay there. Well, by the time the U.S. got there, the Koreans had developed their own government, Korean People's Republic. It was one of the most democratic republics, and it was strongly influenced by the left because the left had fought not only against Japan and its colonization, but against the capitalism that the Japanese had brought in. So the communists in Korea had tremendous support. They were very independent, they were tough, and they began organizing the country. And in fact, Harry Truman had a secret special envoy who went there after the war, and he came back and he wrote a memo to Truman, and he said, communism could get off to a better start in Korea than anywhere else in the world. And he wasn't positive in saying that. Because the Korean people seized the Japanese factories, began running them. Korean peasants seized the Japanese farms, began running them. They elected a government. put forward one of the most progressive domestic and foreign policies. When the U.S. came in the South, they saw this and they couldn't have it. So they brought in Syngman Rhee and declared all of it illegal. The New Labor Movement, the People's Republic, and all of this was also very strong in Jeju Island. Right? And so what happened is then, when the U.S. did that, the North, the Soviets on their side suddenly said, well, wait, we thought there was kind of this country, and if you're going to be starting to rip apart what was a united government, they began to sort of exercise more control on their side, and you begin to get this division between North and South. Right? But in the South, the people didn't want this division. The North didn't either. The U.S. knew that it couldn't control both sides of Korea because there was a powerful North supported by the Soviet Union. So since they couldn't control all of Korea, they said, we'll just take half. And they basically went through a very crooked deal with the United Nations and conducted an election that every group in Korea boycotted except for some right-wing parties. Had no standing. And it was this election and this process that Brian was describing why the people in Jeju started to resist, and the U.S., South Korean forces with U.S. leadership went in and massacred people, and people were resisting, and hundreds of thousands of people died in an attempt to stop this. And this was sort of the origins leading up to the Korean War, where you're really having a war, a civil war between a popular movement on one side and this imposed movement on the other. When the Korean War ended, so I guess the important point to say here is that there was a right wing in Korea that had been tied to the Japanese, and the only thing that saved them was the U.S. intervention. People from the North came to the South, the U.S. came in, got rid of this popular movement, reimposed people who were tied to Japan, and you begin to get this alliance between the U.S. military and militarism that wants Korea as a forward base, and the right wing. And what we see, and what I'll go through very, very quickly because I don't want to spend too much time here, is this ongoing movement between forces in Korea and forces in the U.S. that embrace militarism and do so in a way to suppress popular movements and popular needs of people who have a strong vision and desire for democracy and peace. So when the Korean War ended, there was a Geneva Convention to settle this. Because when the Korean War ended, there's never been a peace treaty ending the Korean War. It was only an armistice stopping the fighting. The U.S. would not agree to a peace, said later. So we had this armistice, and if you read some of the memoirs of the people from the U.S., from the Western side, it's very clear that they all agree that the U.S. did not want peace. The North Koreans and the Chinese who fought said, well, let's just have an election in Korea, monitored election to see, let the people of Korea create a new government. And the U.S. said, no, only an election in the North. In the South, it's our government, and we're not going to allow it, And so they essentially destroyed the conference. And they wanted it to end without any peace treaty because they didn't want to lose in negotiation what they had gotten by, declaring that the South was theirs. And Syngman Rhee, who was the president, that was his position because if the U.S. had a unified government, agreed to a unified government, nobody liked him. Finally, in 1960, he was overthrown by a student demonstration. And someone came in who was kind of a liberal person, and it opened up, and political movements sprang up anew. And the South Korean student movement called for the North Korean student movement to a joint meeting to talk about reunifying the country. And a military coup happened 1 month before that meeting. This guy named Park Chung-hee made a military coup precisely because the country was moving to reunification. And here was the military who had fought this bloody war to keep that from happening, right? And they didn't want that. The U.S. supported it. And from 61 to 1979, the most brutal dictatorship, took hold in Korea. And the history of the left, the history of all this stuff was made illegal. And so the people of Jeju, people all over the country, couldn't speak about any of these things. The history was lost, right? But slowly but surely, people began to resist this Park Chung-hee government. And Park Chung-hee was prepared to call out the military to shoot the people who were demonstrating. And the head of the CIA went out and did his study of what was going on, came back and said, this is going to be a bloodbath, and he assassinated Puff Chung. Yeah, that's right. Thank you for clarifying that. Yeah. So again, a momentary opening, and people started, coming out, forming unions, student groups. The history had been lost, but their desire for independence was not. And so what happened? Another military coup. A man named Chun Doo-hwan comes in with U.S. support and essentially clamps down again. This is where the Gwangju uprising, some of you may have heard about, where people in Gwangju in the southwest resisted the coup. And so Chun Doo-hwan sent paratroopers with U.S. support and essentially isolated the city, and then the people in the city, they came into the city and they started bayoneting students. It was some of the most brutal stuff you've ever seen. And the students broke into the whole city. People broke into the armories, seized weapons, forced the military out, right? And then Chun Doo-hwan went to the U.S. and said, I need to bring troops from the border. Forget that North Korea is really a threat. I want these troops
From the DMZ.
from the DMZ to take the city.
What year was that?
1980. So Park Chung-hee killed in 79. Chun Doo-hwan declares a coup in May of 1980, and the Gwangju uprising happened. The U.S. said, well, we want to get involved, but take the troops and suppress them.
And Carter personally, through Holbrooke,
Right.
agreed to have the U.S. troops and the Korean troops of the DMZ go to Gwangju.
And basically, they decided that, and in fact, they blamed the independence, the people wanting independence, for causing trouble, because this was creating a problem for U.S. foreign policy. So, people of Gwangju were suppressed. Thousands of them were killed. And again, this darkness settles over Korea with the U.S. And of course, what was important to the U.S. is having a military government that allowed a U.S. military base, that allowed U.S. to practice live maneuvers, to be close to China, to have atom bomb, nuclear weapons there that were totally under the U.S. control. Very critical for the U.S., for the U.S. military, and of course for the right wing in Korea. Basically, from that point till 87, the movement starts again. Gwangju is very important because this began a moment when progressive movements in Korea began to reevaluate the U.S. From 61 to 79, the left history had been destroyed. And so people no longer had that, and they thought, oh, the U.S. is our savior. They'll help us. Because we're so for democracy, right? And because they didn't have their own history. And what happened is after Gwangju, people began to reevaluate. Maybe the U.S. really does want division. Maybe the U.S. really doesn't care. They have their own interests. And so the left began to reconnect to its history, and began to lead this very powerful democratization movement. And by 1987, they finally won the right to directly elect president. And finally, in 92, they elected a civilian president. And what happened, though, is that even though it was a civilian president, it was not a left president, kind of a liberal president. They didn't like the left because the left was challenging the whole nature of the country.
Was that Kim Dae-jung?
This is Kim Young-sam.
Okay.
Kim Dae-jung follows, but similar story here. And remember what happened in 1994 is that the U.S. and North Korea almost came to war. The U.S. was threatening to bomb North Korea, whom they said had a nuclear program. And Kim Young-sam has talked about how he called up Bill Clinton and begged him, don't do this. Don't bomb North Korea because it'll be a Holocaust for us. And Clinton said, no, we're going ahead. And it was only Jimmy Carter who then went to North Korea, who negotiated with the North for an agreement. And in fact, knowing the government the way he did, he said, I'm going on CNN right now. I'm not going to wait for you to decide, to tell everyone so you can't keep hidden the fact that the North is willing to negotiate with us. Right? But what happened is that Kim Young-sam and then Kim Dae-jung, the next president, used the threat of the North to try and suppress the left. The very strong left. And again, national security, the way we use it to suppress whether it's the Occupy movement or the labor movement or anti-globalization movements or whatever, these governments did that. And so the left got weaker and weaker again, but at least there's sort of these tentative movements to democracy. The most recent president, not the one we have now, who followed Kim Dae-jung, is a man named Roh Moo-hyun. And Roh Moo-hyun is important for the following reasons. He got elected. He was someone who wasn't. No one thought he could ever become president. And what happened was in 2002, when he ran for president, the U.S. was preparing for war against the North again. And he said in his campaign, if the U.S. attacks North Korea and I'm president, South Korean troops will not support that invasion. And it was very gutsy. And young people from all over the country, through the internet and everything, built up support, and he won the presidency. And he tried to pursue a better policy with the North. He's the one who declared Jeju Island, Island of Peace, protection. He started the Korean Truth and Reconciliation Commission to go back into some of this history. But he was very weak. And he was so afraid of the U.S., who openly hated him, that he would try and do everything he could to keep the U.S. from destroying the possibility of peace with the North. So against the desires of the Korean people, he sent troops to Afghanistan. Say, U.S., look, we're really with you. It's just on this one issue, right? But the other side is he was a real neoliberal, and he allowed the large companies to take over and dominate the economy. And the result was, when his term ended, although he was not a leftist, because sort of like, people say Obama's a socialist.
Yeah.
Well, that's what people were saying about Roh Moo-hyun. Because he was so weak, and his policies, like Obama, were neoliberal, he ended up discrediting the left. Even though, just like now, Obama's weakness and his embrace of all this stuff discredits the left because people see him on the left, even though we know he's not. The consequence was his inability to really push through on these things led to the current president, who's this right-winger. And the first thing he did was break every agreement that the previous two presidents had made with the North, go after labor even more severe, and then begin the construction of the base in Jeju. So all of this, I guess, flows as a piece. And the parts I'm trying to stress here is this continual push on the part of the U.S. militarism to be in the region, to be there militarily, without any care for the cost of the people, the cost of another Korean War, American lives, if we say who cares, but Korean lives, the nature of this division, the nature of the oppression that exists in the North and in the South, the militarism as our excuse for being in Japan. But there's also a Korean right wing that welcomes it. They're partners. This isn't just the U.S. telling the Korean what to do. It's an attempt by both sides to resurrect and sustain an environment that's extremely costly for all the people. And what I think we struggle against is not only each moment, but a coherent picture of this history that helps us understand what we're facing. And I think, in the United States, we have this lack of memory or knowledge of what our role is. We're the great defenders of Korea, we think, right? We're there. I'm sorry? Okay. And at the same time, the Koreans, this may startle you, but there's a presidential election coming up, and the Conservative Party, you know who their candidate is? It's the daughter of Park Chung-hee, who people are now, we need a strong, So, there's as much confusion there as there is here, right? And so these fights on behalf of brave people in Jeju are tied to a lot. And I guess what the challenge for us is to not only stand by them, but to do so in a way that helps connect to their history and to our history, so we see that these are not just accidents, and they're not just, the result of mistakes, but of a coherent policy that we all need to understand and resist. And I guess that's why I'm really honored to be with people here who who understand that and from their own experience and who have that kind of broader understanding and live it all the time. So, thank you.
Thank you.